Thank you. Hello, everybody. Again, last couple meetings we were speaking about the position of church in God's eyes, that it is a new nation and separate from all other nations of the world. And in spiritual world, it is seen as a stone which is separated and outside of the idol, which is in Book of Daniel. And the stone then comes and crushes and destroys the idol. And that is how the true religion, true faith of God's nation destroys the false religious systems together with their government systems. The earthly, the worldly nations. Today we will continue, probably finish the topic, and I wanted together with you to review several points, a couple of formal or official things and couple informal, more like culturological things, which are also related to the position of church and how it was substituted. And the very first point which I wanted to touch was actually what is the church and why we use this word church in English language, because there is some substitution which came into this linguistic point. The word church in English and in many European languages like Kirche in German, Cerkov in Slavic languages, it originates from Greek word kyriakon, which comes originally from the word kyrios, which means lords, or something belonging to the Lord, or something belonging to the master, from the word kyrios. And that is actually not the word which is used in Greek text of New Testament. The word kyriakon in New Testament actually is used only in 2 places, and in both places it is correctly translated as something belonging to the Lord. We can see it in 1 Corinthians 11:20, where it means Lord's Supper, and in Revelation 1:10, where it means the Lord's Day. Those are the only words where the kyriakon is used. All other places in New Testament where we translate it as church, it is actually a Greek word ecclesia, which is completely different root as we hear, and it has completely different meaning. The word ecclesia comes from word kale, which means to call together, and this is a name which means more assembly or congregation of political and judicial power. That is the meaning of it. And it is interesting that in the first translation, and now we will touch and we will analyze why this word was used in English language, in Greek language. But first I wanted to mention that in the very first translation of New Testament into English, well, Wycliffe was the very first, then I mean the Tyndale's translation also, the word ecclesia of Greek text of New Testament was translated correctly. It was translated as congregation. And you can see here, for example, in Matthew 16:18, the famous text about church, Tyndale, in that interesting English spelling of his time, he translated ecclesia as congregation. And that's how it was in all other places. But when Tyndale's translation was taken as a fundamental, the foundation of King James translation, already government authorized translation, which was made for state English church, with King James approving the translation, it was brought to his attention that the word ecclesia can be translated in 2 ways. It can be translated as congregation, or it can be translated with the word church, which means belonging to Lord, a building, because kyriakon, which is something belonging to Lord, means also a building belonging to the Lord. So the original meaning of the word church is actually building. And that's exactly why King James thought that we should use this word. We should use the word church because it is state church of England. And congregation is something fuzzy, it's something non-controllable, it's something not official, but we want something formalized. And that's why it should be about buildings, because we control buildings. And that's why we will use this word. That's how this word came to English language. Of course, later with development of Protestant movement and what we know now, we usually tell that church is not building, church is the people. That's where we actually return back to the original meaning of the word ecclesia, congregation. But there was serious attempt to modify this meaning. Well, now we should see also that the word ecclesia, there is at least several places in Bible where it is translated correctly. And let us see it. It is, for example, in book of Acts 19:32, where the word ecclesia is translated correctly in English, King James Version also. Some therefore, I read Acts 19:32, some therefore cried one thing and some another, for the assembly was confused and the more part knew not wherefore they were come together. So what is meant here? The word ecclesia is correctly translated as assembly, which is a political entity of the city, people coming together, something like parliament. But it was like very broad parliament where all men of the city were participating, all free men. Another place, there are actually only 3 places in New Testament that the word ecclesia is translated correctly. And another place in Acts 19:39, the same context, but if you inquire anything concerning other matters, it should be determined in a lawful assembly. Again, lawful assembly, it is political entity here. And another place, it is kind of the same context, is Acts 19:41. For we are in a danger to be caught in question for this day's uproar, there being no cause whereby we may give an account of the concourse. And when he had thus spoken, he dismissed the assembly. Again, the word assembly here translates the word ecclesia. That is the only 3 places where the word ecclesia was correctly translated into English, in contrary to the church used instead of it. So we understand that in God's terminology, the terminology which he had put through apostles into New Testament, this word must be used. Now my question is, why specifically this word is used for assembly or congregation or gathering of the people? Greek language is very rich language, and it has many synonyms for assemblies of people. For example, they could use the word synagogue. Good word. Jews decided to use this word, and what does it mean? Sin, the prefix sin means coming together, and agoge means learning or training. So the word synagogue means learning together, which is a good word for a place where people come to study scriptures together. That's why Jews actually took this word for their congregation. Or so that could be a good word for church, right? Another good word, if you're a fan of church potlucks and ad hoc gatherings at church, another good word will be symposium. Though nowadays it's mostly used in scientific academical context, but the original meaning is from prefix sim, together, and pinein, that's the verb to drink. So it's actually drinking together, it's partying, drinking and eating. It is a church potluck. That also could be a good word, right? But God did not choose synagogue, God did not choose symposium. Through his apostles, he did not choose even more precise meaning probably for religious denomination. Greek language has 2 words which can mean religious denomination. It is kinonia or airesies. Actually, from word airesia comes English word heresy, which is pretty much denomination or teaching, religious teaching. But God did not choose those words also. So he didn't choose any words for any kind of congregation, but he chose specifically ecclesia. And ecclesia he was chosen because this word is a governmental assembly. That's the only word of congregation, which means a governmental assembly, an assembly convoked by special officers and possessing political power and judicial functions. So God sees his church as a parliament or like a political and judicial entity for his nation, because his nation is a nation, his people is a nation. It's like a country. Yes, it is spread across all planet, across all countries of this world. It's spread, but it is still a country. It is still a state. It's God's kingdom on this planet, and yes, it has its own political entity. That's what ecclesia is. Talking about the powers of ecclesia, power of the church in God's eyes, we should tell that it's not just political entity, it is also judicial entity. It is a court where the judgment is done. And God's word is very specific about people of church, God's people, to be judged only by the judges of God's congregation of church. Let us see. In Corinthians, first epistle to Corinthians, chapter 6, from the very beginning of epistle, we read, "Dare any of you having a matter against another to go to law before the unjust and not before the saints?" So what does it mean go to the law? It is for court, for judgment. Then, "Do ye not know that the saints shall judge the world? And if the world shall be judged by you, are ye unworthy to judge the smallest matters?" And then in verse 4 and on I read, "If then you have judgments of things pertaining to this life, set them to judge who are least esteemed in the church," meaning outsiders, non-believers. "I speak to your shame. Is it so that there is not a wise man among you? No, not one that shall be able to judge between his brethren, but brother goes to law with brother, and that before the unbelievers." So Apostle Paul actually tells it as a shame that people in church, believers, go to judicial power of the state, meaning in that case Roman Empire, or that province, Achaia province of Roman Empire where Corinth was. So because the judgment should be done in the church, the judgment should be done by elders of the church. That's because it is country and citizens of the country are subject to the law and judgment of that country. And this country is not worldly country, it's different. So this understanding actually that believers should be judged by their religious leaders, it is not unique to New Testament. The same understanding was for for Jews, and the same understanding was in Eastern countries, Central Asia and Middle East, through all history until recent times, until modern times. For example, let us see Roman Empire. We'll often tell that Roman Empire is so suppressive and they conquered Judea. Yes, they did, but Jews were supposed to judge their criminals or any other cases according to Jewish laws by rabbis. And we see it in John, for example, 18th chapter of Gospel of John, verse 31. Then when Pilate tells about Jesus, "Then said Pilate unto them, Take ye him and judge him according to your law." The Jews therefore said unto him, it's not lawful for us to put any man to death. So over here, they tell about limitation. So they were given all powers to judge according to Torah, to law of God. They were given power to judge and condemn and punish in many ways, but not just not putting to death. By the way, there was an exception. If a person came to the temple and defiled and did something wrong in the temple, defiled the temple, they had permission to kill that person in place. But for all other cases, it was impossible for them to put to death. So Romans did limit it, but they still had religious courts. Interestingly, the same idea was maintained in Middle East through Middle Ages, how I was telling. In all Muslim empires, Jews and Christians had their own courts, and Muslims had their own courts. So this idea that the judgment should be done by theologians, at least, if not prophet, if there's no prophet around, not possible, at least a person well-versed in God's law. This idea was in that culture, in that territory. Even in Quran, it is explicitly told, and that's how it was applied. We can read in Surah 5, verses 43 and 47, what is told about Jews and Christians. But how is it that they come to you for judgment while they have the Torah, in which is the judgment of Allah? And in verse 47, it's told about Christians. Let the people of the gospel judge by what Allah has revealed therein, meaning in gospel. That's the instruction and how it was functioning in those countries, that Jews were judged in synagogue, not inside synagogues, but by rabbis, and Christians were judged by patriarchs or some leaders of Christian churches. So the situation which we have in this world now is purely Western, modern, totalitarian approach of government to judicial system. The system where government takes full control over judgment and does not leave it to God's nation to judge its people. In the United States, they tried actually to alleviate the situation a bit. That's why religious systems can have mediators, but it's just mediators, but it still does not have real judicial power. I want to emphasize now that I don't talk about unity of church and state. No, the church and worldly state cannot be united because church is a separate state. Church is not this worldly state. But this separation does not mean submission. It does not mean that the church must be submit to worldly state. Well, talking about state, actually, we know, and it is very well shown in American system, that there are three branches of power, right? Which branches? We know it from school: judicial, legislative, and executive. Let us see, actually God shows in Bible these branches, and something interesting what we do incorrectly about those three branches. In Isaiah, in 33:22, Isaiah 33:22, I read, "For the Lord is our judge, the Lord is our lawgiver, the Lord is our king. He will save us." Well, I see all three branches of power here. Lord is our judge, judicial power. Lord is our lawgiver, so legislative power. And Lord is our king, so executive power, executive branch. All three are ultimately at God's power. So they eventually are from God. But interestingly, God shows that two of those branches he delegates to people. We can see in Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy 16:18, we read, "Judges and officers shall thou make thee in all thy gates, which the Lord thy God gives thee, throughout thy tribes, and they shall judge the people with just judgment." So, yes, all three powers, the judgment and executive and legislation, is God's. But he tells that you must make judges and officers. And he tells specifically about judgment, but officers are those who write. It's the word there is about being a scribe or writing, but it's also related to management. So it's kind of an executive power, those who enforce something. And we know that God was actually appointing in the original design of his kingdom, of Israeli kingdom, not kingdom yet, but Israeli nation, when he established in times of Joshua ben Nun, he was appointing judges, and they were judging, and they were also leading the troops in war. And that was kind of the only application of executive power needed. It is the only executive power needed is to be the chief in command, the commander in war. So God delegates that to certain people, to judges and officers, so executive and judicial power. But interestingly, God does not delegate the legislative power. Okay, we'll touch it. So, but by now, we see that judges are appointed by God, ideally prophet, or high priests or priests were also serving as judges in ancient time, but at least theologian, because the judgment should be made according to God's law. The whole idea of judgment in the Bible is, let us read it, Exodus 18:16. What does Moses tell? Exodus 18:16. When they have a matter, they come unto me, and I judge between one and another, and do make them know the statutes of God and his laws. So the whole idea of judgment is about God's statutes and God's laws and God's will. So it's not about studying years in college about precedents of some decisions of people, or that is about Anglo-Saxon system of judgment, right? Or about precedents. So somebody in sometimes 100 years ago did it, and that's how it was decided. Or the Roman law, the second large system of legislation in the world, is about codex of laws. It's not precedent-based, it's a codex-based, and it's a Roman system of law. So no, because that is also human-made, that is also product of human negotiation. All precedents and codexes of laws are product of human negotiation, but legislative is something made by God. So judicial branch, judging, is about making to people, applying to people laws of God, Torah. And legislative branch belongs only to God. We read that in James 4, for example, where he writes that there is one lawgiver. And that's what we see through all Bible. God never tells any person, any human being in Bible to make law. Not any law, not any very smallest law. No, only God makes the laws. People can just apply laws or misapply them. So it means that people cannot judge against God's law. That is illusion. And people cannot make up new laws contradicting to God's law. Wait a minute. Can we make laws changing laws of gravity? No. Can we make a law changing how multiplication is done, or changing the pi number, or speed of light? No. Then why do you think that we can make a law legalizing murders? I speak about abortions, for example. This is a legalized murder, and people think that they made law about it. No. The best thing which our Congress can do is making orders. So speaking in legal language, Congress doesn't make laws. Congress makes an orders, and those orders can either go align it with God's law or contradict God's law. If they contradict, they are not applicable to God's people, because we have only one lawmaker. Look, Daniel was on a very high position. He was vizier, which was a counselor of the king in Babylonian Empire, and after that, when Persians conquered it, he was the same position in Babylonian kingdom of Persian Empire. And did he live really by Babylonian or Persian law? Those laws for him were like orders, but the real law was the law of God. And when those laws were contradict the Persian laws or anything, orders were contradicting the law of God, worse for them, they're ignored. That's why his opponents knew it. His enemies in Daniel 6:5 tell, then said this man, we shall not find any occasion against his Daniel, except we find it against him concerning the law of his God. They knew that there is no other laws for Daniel. And when the order of the king was against law of God, it's ignored. Well, we already talked that church follows God's law, not state's law, which is not law for us. Interestingly, even not official religious decisions or legislations. Not something like church manual or something which is decided by some conferences or by some bishop or cardinal or anything. Those things are also just like orders, but because even inside the church, people in leadership position inside the church, they are executive and judicial power, but they are not legislative power. The law is done only by God. And when God speaks, everybody else is keeping silence. In book of Acts 5:29, Peter and apostles tell to religious leaders. Then Peter and apostles answered and said, we ought to obey God rather than men. They did not tell it to Romans, and they did not tell it to other fishermen. They were telling it to priests and high priests, the people of the highest religious authority. But God's law is a law, everything else is a lower level. That's how it's supposed to be for the church. Now regarding executive law, that's where usually people get confused, because sometimes we read such an interesting verses. For example, in Peter 2:13, first epistle of Peter 2:13, we read, submit yourself to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether it be to the king or as supreme, or unto governors, as unto them that are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers, and for the praise of them that do well. Well, here Peter obviously speaks about executive power. So we told the legislative power is only God. Judicial power are only those who know God's law and judge according to God's law. And what is executive power for us? The one who just has power. In this case, it's the kings or governments. Why? Because they can punish, because they have weapons, etc. That is executive power. So read in Romans 13:4, for example, Paul also describes, for he is a minister of God to thee for good, but if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he bears not the sword in vain, but he is a minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that does evil. Again, he speaks about executive power. So our respect to civil power should be only on this level. Is there just executive branch for us? They cannot judge and they cannot give law. That's what comes explicitly from Bible teaching. So church submitting to executive power should ignore legislative and judicial power of secular countries where it is geographically located. Well, the continuation actually, because we see how it happened, we see that even in Middle Ages, in many countries, specifically Middle Eastern countries, that was not the case, but that's how it happened. And the continuation of it actually during all history, the governments were also usurping the usage of churches as political tool. And that was used through enforcing certain preaching in the churches. We talk about cases where in Middle Ages, for example, where church and state were united, but even now it can continue through certain government propaganda. And we can see it in many things which still state in theology, even in Protestant theology. Church usually was preaching in every country that God supports their country against other countries. That is kind of an interesting approach of pulling God into political game between countries. And that was what's happening, for example, in Middle Ages, when there were wars between Saracens and Spanish and then French in Iberian Peninsula in Spain. The Catholics declared that these Saracens are locusts, which are in Book of Revelation. Interestingly, later when Crusaders were invading into Middle East and there were Muslims and Jews and Christians in Middle East suffering from them, Syrian Christians or Christians of Asia Minor, they were telling that Crusaders are those locusts. So they were preaching the same thing against those Catholic Crusaders. So the same attempt to use Bible as a part of own political agenda. So although in Revelation 9:4, it is openly told that the locusts are actually coming as a theme of sealing. That was told in Revelation 9:4 when it cannot hurt anyone. And the other things, that is a special separate topic in Book of Revelation. Well, but another example which you can bring, for example, the confrontation between Protestant England and Catholic Spain. And there was a Spanish armada sent to English coast, which was defeated. And it was defeated. The English churches, of course, were praying for English Navy. Spanish churches, of course, were praying for Spanish Navy. And when it was defeated in England, it was kind of a proverb. Everybody was telling God is Protestant. That's how it was told in newspapers, if we can name it newspaper of that time. It was quite different, but that's how it was proclaimed through all country. God is Protestant. Or think about First World War or Second World War, and the Christian countries pretty much fighting with each other. And while here in America, they were praying in all churches and preaching in all churches for victory of allies, guess what they were preaching and praying about in Germany? Vice versa. So when the church is in submission to government, it is used as a political instrument. And that is so sad because God is not into all that politics. Modern evangelical churches mostly look at the Middle East political situation and see Israel, country which is there, which is just worldly, ordinary country like all other countries. They see it as the same as Israel of Bible, which is not the same. The Israel, which is in modern time Israel, is not God's nation. It's just ordinary worldly nation. But it leads to certain political consequences from that evangelical Christians. Again, wrapping Bible around your own political agenda. That is something what countries do and secular countries do, and unfortunately church quite often follows this trap. Interestingly, in Bible, we see examples where God, even through his prophets, was preaching even against his own nation. We can see it in book Jeremiah. In Jeremiah, book Jeremiah is full of examples where God is opening to prophet to say to his nation, to Judea, to Israel, that they will be taken captive by Babylonians. And it sounds so strange because they are, after all, descendants of Abraham, and Babylonians are explicit idol worshippers. But God, again, God is not into politics. If he needs to use idol worshipper Babylonians to punish bad Israelites, he does it. And Jeremiah was so many times punished for it. He was put into jail. He was suspected to be to betray his country. And for example, we read in Jeremiah 37:13, when it is told to him openly, thou fallest away to Chaldeans, because he wanted to go from city to another place. So, and he was put in jail. So this idea that even Israel can be not as a God's nation in some cases, in some application, it can be seen in the Bible even earlier. For example, when David makes a census, you remember it? It's very bad example. It's a very bad error which David made. So many people died for it. Why? Why was he making census? Because of taxes and army. There are usually only two cases why kings are counting their people: to organize a taxation system and to evaluate the size of the army. Now, the God is against it because if David does it, he sees God's nation, Israel is God's nation, he sees God's nation as his own political instrument with financial and military dimensions, that he can use it in financial and military applications. And God is against that. And even his general job is against that. That's why it is written, we can read it in Chronicles, 1 Chronicles 21:6, that Job does not count Levites. 1 Chronicles 21:6, Job goes to make census, to enforce census and count people across all country. But 21:6, but Levi and Benjamin counted he not among them, for the king's word was abominable to Job. Interestingly, Job, military guy here, understands more than David, who is chosen, anointed by God, even has a prophetic spirit. In certain cases, he was acting as prophet. But here, Joab understands it better. Regarding Benjamin, it's kind of very clear because Benjamin is a tribe of Saul, and they were the tribe which were the less friendly to David. Probably they really did not want to, because it was just recently that Saul, their king, was killed, and there were confrontations, there was civil war between people of David and family of Saul and Benjamin tribe. So it is clear why it was difficult to count them, because they could be really not friendly. But Levites, well, Levites, because Levites are God's ministers, and no, they are not part of your political instrument. That's why they should not be counted. Well, we touched certain formal, official aspects, and now, if we have time, we can touch several aspects which are not so official, because when we talk about political power, judicial, legislative, etc. But it's not about culture, right? So what about culture? Because we know that different countries still have different cultures, so different nations have different cultures. So definitely God's nation must have its own culture, a culture instilled by God. And if we think about it, there are certain things which constitute the culture of the nation. And God's church cannot grow on the ground polluted by worldly culture. I just want to repeat it. God's church cannot grow on the ground polluted by worldly cultures. The ground should be of God's culture. And it is important to understand that the culture described in the Bible is not Jewish, because what culture Jews did have in the beginning? When Abraham was coming out from Ur Chaldean, he had Aramaic culture. He is Aramean. It is told in Deuteronomy. And then the whole Jewish nation comes out from Egypt. Guess what is their culture mostly? It's a kind of Egyptian culture, or you can tell it's a mixture of Aramaic and Egyptian culture. But God makes huge work to make a new culture that nation. So what we see described in Bible is not Jewish culture. It is a culture which is created by God. And Jews kind of inherited it and continued it. Yeah, they changed, they transformed many things. But interestingly, because of influence of Abraham, because of influence in times of David and Solomon, and later many Jews were there, all Middle East was kind of transformed and got some influence, quite serious influence, of godly biblical culture. So when it is thought that those things in the Bible are inapplicable to our society, yeah, of course, because if our society is Gentile, very far from God's culture, it will not be applicable. But God wants people, his people, to live as a different kind of society. So the very first thing in the culture of whenever nation or country you see, the very first thing which makes impact of the culture is a history of the nation. Yeah, history. It is in past, but its results are in present and they will go into future. History of the nation is something which makes the biggest impact of how people think, act, live every day. And here we see great example because Bible actually is the most ancient and most full narration of history of a nation. Many nations have their histories written by some smart guys who were gathering some information, observing something, and putting all together on one scroll. Yeah, there are many histories. So, but there is only one nation, and I will not even tell Jews. I will tell God's nation, which is described because so full from the very beginning, from the moment of creation of earth, Genesis chapter 1. And possibly the last chapters of history which we see in Bible are Book of Acts. So from Genesis to Acts, there are many historical books which we can know that they are true, unlike most of the history created by mankind. Because most of academic history is just scholarized rumors. Somebody told somebody something, and they wrote, and then somebody copied it. That's scholarized rumors. And it can be true if you find good evidences and many evidences from many points. Yeah, most probably it is true, but you must dig it up and find where these evidences come from. Probably they can be based on somebody very long ago lying. I mean, it is very difficult to analyze history, but over here in Bible, we have a history which is kind of endorsed by God. It's given, and it is given through his people. It's not even many of them refer to previous evidences, not documenting it, often not documenting it the usual way how academic history is documented. Although Luke was trying to do it, but Moses did not. But if we believe that Bible is word of God, that is history. And interestingly, that is one of the first points where secular power or worldly countries, worldly nations are trying to undermine God's nation because they try to undermine the history described in Bible. And it was coming in so many different ways. For example, Bible was often mentioned the nation of Hittites. Hittites were mentioning as normal as usual as we here in America mention China. I mean, it's just for them, Hittites was a large and powerful country, well, to north from them. But ancient sources, ancient Romans and ancient Greeks never mentioned it, and Egyptians also did, there were long period of time were not known Egyptian mentions of Hittites. That's why many people in academia, they were telling that, well, it is an error of Bible. Hittites never existed. There is no such nation. They were mentioning it as a powerful empire, but it's not on the map. Until very end of 19th century, it was discovered We discovered lots of archaeology in Asia Minor. When they started to make more excavation in Turkey, modern Turkey, we discovered that there was a big country. And then we discovered more, we deciphered more manuscripts from Egypt and found how Egypt and Hittite actually were having wars for domination in Middle East. So they were two superpowers. So that attempt didn't pass, but the bigger attempt to undermine history of Bible is actually an attempt to undermine the first 10 chapters of Genesis. It's an attempt to undermine the whole narration of creation. And it is made, interestingly, it is made in order to destroy the culture of God's nation, but it is made so much with our money. Because guess who is brainwashing children with some propaganda? I mean, biology is a science, like 95% of biology is science, but there's some 5% of propaganda. And for some reason, in education curriculum, in schools, that propaganda part is put so much. And who is paying for those churches? Believers also, our taxes. So it's a very unjust system where God's nation is robbed, and that resources are used then to undermine the culture of God's nation through undermining history. Very connected to history are feasts, right? Every nation has certain things to celebrate and certain things to mourn. And God's feasts are described in Torah. There are 7 things which Lord names his feasts. It's in Leviticus 23. Chapter 23 is all about feasts of the Lord. I read Leviticus 23:2. Speak unto the children of Israel and say unto them, concerning the feasts of the Lord, which ye shall proclaim to be holy convocations, even these are my feasts. And then whole chapter he describes, and there's 7 things: Shabbat, Pesach, Passover, Yom HaBikurim, the feast of first fruit. It's the 3rd day after Passover. The Shavuot, the Pentecost, the 7 full weeks passed after Passover. And then in the 7th month, in fall, there are other 3 feasts: the Yom Teruah, the Feast of Trumpets. Notice, I don't tell Rosh Hashanah because it's not Rosh Hashanah. It's Yom Teruah. It's not New Year. It's Day of Trumpet. Day of Trumpets. Then Yom HaKippurim, Day of Mercy, or Yom Kippur we'll also name it, and then Sukkot, the day of Feast of Tabernacles or Feast of Booths. So those are 7 things, and interestingly, those 7 things are 52 Shabbats in a year, and Sukkot is 7 days. It lasts 7 days, so the 12 days in those 6 calendar feasts, 12 days and plus 52 Shabbats. So in total, there's 64 days in a year, which are feast days. 52 plus 12. How much they were changed? How much God's nation has respect to feasts of the state, the common feasts of the civil calendar, or even to feasts of other religious systems like Christmas, which is not biblical, or Easter, which is not biblical, or Sunday, which is not biblical. All those things come to replace feasts of the Lord, which is given in Torah, Leviticus 23. And interestingly, it happened not only to Christians, it happened to Jews also. That's why I don't tell Rosh Hashanah, because New Year, the Rosh Hashanah means New Year, right? And when they celebrated it September, on the day which is named Yom Teruah, the Day of Trumpets. But is it really New Year? What does Bible tell about New Year? In Bible, we can open Exodus 12:2 and read. It's about Passover. And at the Passover, God tells to Moses, this month shall be unto you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. It's very open. When does the year start? For us also, the year starts in the middle of March, 2 weeks before the Passover. 2 weeks before the Pesach. That's why that month, September, October, was always named seventh month. And Yom Teruah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot, all those 3 feasts are in the seventh month of the calendar. But after Babylonian captivity, Jews, together with losing many other things in their culture, including language even, they lost their understanding when the New Year starts, and they started to celebrate it in September as Rosh Hashanah, which they took from local people of Mesopotamia. Actually, Babylonians had kind of, some nations there had a New Year in September, some had in March, and because the month Tishrei, that's how this month started, they started to name that month after Babylonian captivity, Tishrei, before they were just naming it seventh month. The Tishrei comes from Akkadian word Tishretu, which means beginning. So for Akkadian, ancient Akkadians, it was the first month of the year, September. That's why our academic month also starts from September. It is Babylonian heritage. So the feasts were changed. God's nation lost this part of the culture also. What else is interesting? When we talk to people from other cultures or from other nations, I observe when I tell I am from Azerbaijan, one of the first questions which I am asked, I actually feel very happy to answer, because I tell, yes, our cuisine is one of the richest cuisine in the world. Because one of the fundamental things of the culture of people is food, cuisine, what people eat, what they cook, how they cook, etc. Did God work on creating that dimension of the culture of his nation? Of course he did. There are certain principles of food which God puts in the Bible for his nation, but there are certain other principles which people started to follow, and they follow in worldly nations. God's principles, there are two, actually, two. One is creation model, another is health. So principle of food are creation model and health. How? We see that God makes distinction between clean and unclean animals. And he tells that originally plants are given for food, and that is original God's design, plants. But after that, because after the flood, there is certain degradation in biosphere, and in certain areas it was even impossible to live only with plants. Good luck being vegetarian when you are Eskimo. It's impossible in far north or somewhere in desert where nothing almost grows. So it was given, or in some islands also, where there are not enough plants diversity with nutrients, etc. So it was allowed to eat certain animals, only clean animals. So why do I tell that over here the creation model is in food model? Because first of all, by creation, plants were made as fabrics of food. Plants are those which produce food, and animals, many animals are made, I believe, as our co-neighbors on this planet, but there are certain animals which are made as garbage processors, and besides swine, obviously, or like sharks, etc., but there are also many small beings like insects, different arthropods, etc., worms. They're definitely garbage processors. And there is one more kingdom of living beings created, fungi, the mushrooms. They are also saprophytes, garbage processors. So all those things God didn't give for food. So here he gave plants originally, and then he allows clean animals. Interestingly, if we know that after the sin, the first sin of Adam, the whole biosphere of the planet goes to degradation. And if we look on animals, how they were changing over the time, we can observe that some animals degraded much more than others. And guess which? The unclean animals is by definition those animals which degrade faster. The clean animals, and there are very few of them, right? They're mostly like rams, sheep, goats, cattle, and deers. So they're very some fish. So they're very few. They degraded to less extent. So that's why I believe it was important for people also to eat those who degraded less, because somehow it affects our health. And here we'll come to the point of health in nutrition. But yeah, another important point also related to creation model is that God explicitly tells, do not eat with blood. In Genesis 9:4, he tells it to Noah, flesh with the life thereof, with blood you shall not eat. Even evangelical Christians should know it also and should follow it, because even in the book of Acts 15:29, where apostles tells about what the converted, proselytized Greeks, etc. should follow, they tell, Acts 15:29, that ye abstain from meats offered to idols and from blood and from things strangled. And strangling is actually a manner of killing animals, how it is killed now in Western world, mostly in farms. The cattle or chicken, they are killed with electricity. The strangling is meaning that the organism is made not able to breathe and it dies from suffocation. Killing those animals with electricity pretty much goes this way. The shock, the brain switches off, it does not breathe and it suffocates. So it is strangled. And according to Bible, if you want Old Testament, if you want New Testament here in Acts 19:29, it is unclean eating with blood when blood is not drained, or when it is killed not according to the way how it should be killed. And it is known now still that blood should be drained if animals are slaughtered for food, if you are meat eater. But original design is even eating only plants. If it is possible, it's better. So principles of the worldly nations, are quite different. And yeah, what we told about health is kind of replaced here with other things, and the creation principle is even not followed. So the principle is mostly like gluttony, sensationalism, so chasing what can satisfy our senses, what is kind of delicious, etc., and profit. Well, and it fully replaces the whole food culture, because on one side, rich nations with enough resources start inventing over sophisticated exotic meals which combine things which normally are not combined, should not be combined because they kind of biologically contradict to each other. And they mostly it is China and Roman Empire, and they come to certain tastes which are not natural, which do not exist in nature. Nowadays, with chemical industry serving so much the food industry, there are even more tools of creating artificial tastes which do not exist in natural food. So it is a sensationalism in food culture, chasing certain new experiences in food culture. And on another side, it is gluttony also, and consuming more than needed and more than needed of things which are just giving more satisfaction through senses. Usually it contradicts to the principle of health. And I usually tell that if a person prays for health and eat cookies, it is hypocrisy, because like you pray for one thing and then with your actions you vote in a different direction. Your action opposed to your prayer. So it makes no sense. And God probably will believe more your actions than your prayer. On another side, profit. Food industry is huge, and chasing big profits leads to lots of cruelty. And it's also part of our food culture, of not our, hopefully, but this worldly food culture. Industrialized farming is an example of huge cruelty towards animals. If according to Bible, well, animals should be slaughtered in such a way that they do not suffer without giving pain. Industrialized farming gives suffering to those animals even during the lifetime of those animals by keeping them in inconvenient premises and treating them as objects which just must grow and die without. We all know that difference between old style farming and modern farming. And why is it made? It's made to make mostly to make meat cheap, and popularizing the making meat cheap and popularizing consumption of it creates lots of income. Another way, actually, because it becomes more and more difficult to making meat cheap, because more people, more consumers, less resources. Now food industry explores new dimensions, mushrooms or arthropods, those organisms about which we thought they are saprophytes, never designed by God to be food. Actually, they often tell that mushrooms can be counted as plants. Well, we know scientifically that they are not, but can it be that in Old Testament they were counted among plants? And no, it cannot, because in book of Genesis 1:30, when we read what was given as food, and in Genesis 9:3 also, it is told plants are named with the word green herb. It is the word yerek in Hebrew language. What is translated here as green herb, it is the word for plants, and it comes, Hebrew word yerek comes from the verb which means to be green. So it is even linguistically in Bible connected to being green means chlorophyll, photosynthesis. Why? Because photosynthesis is the process on this planet of making food, and plants are fabrics of food. So not mushrooms, not saprophytes, but this is now popularized together with different arthropods, different insects, and bug protein as named. Why? Because it is very cheap. It allows to feed more people, spending less money, less resources. Well, I understand when they think about it, feeding starving people somewhere, but it's not only used for feeding those people who die from hunger. It's used just also as a method of business. And one of probably the best ways would be to go more with plant production instead of meat production. That would allow to produce much more food on the same land, on the same nature resources. So all this, interesting, we told that it's gluttony, sensationalism, and profit. But interestingly, when we compare to those God's principles of health and creation model, which model creates richer cuisine with more variety? And if we compare just modern cuisine, modern food with food of Middle East, and we really see the difference, because how it was put, I was reading recently an article, and it was told that modern food is mostly main vegetables are potatoes and tomatoes. The most popular food are potato, tomato, and flour, sugar, vegetable oil, processed cheese, chicken, and beef, simply put together in different configuration. So it was less than 10 main ingredients. And it is very poor in its variety. And the most of variety is made through different configuration and different additives, artificial flavorings, etc. So biologically speaking, it's very poor. And yeah, of course, it cannot be healthy also. I don't know, regarding time, I think we ran out of the time. Am I right? I don't hear. Did we run out of the time?
You can finish if you wish, but
how many minutes do we have?
We still have some time, about 10 minutes.
10 minutes. All right, then I will probably skim through the red. So besides food, so the next probably point would be about clothing. And we know that people of different nations have different model of clothing. And again, the different principles leading the culture of God's nation. It is the God's design of clothing was to cover body, not to accentuate. And it's modesty, not provocation. And again, not sensationalism. You know what kind of sensationalism I mean. So God's design for God's approach to clothing is completely different from what is proposed by the world. There are multiple phenomena. It sounds like small phenomena like music, sports, movies, television, internet. Those all things are part of the culture, and they are taken differently by God's nation and by worldly nation. Historically, music had the most important, the biggest impact. And it was even that many times countries, conquering other countries, conquering other nations, they were prohibiting, banning certain kinds of music or musical instruments. Like bagpipe was banned in Scotland in 18th century. Or in Poland during Second World War, because it was also a popular Polish instrument. Because music is a very important on that emotional part of the culture. And it became so important instrument in worldly culture nowadays that churches often kind of copy the same thing to churches, which should not be copied. Sports, movies, television, internet, I just name it now. We're running out of time, but each of them is a huge business, and each of them is a big part in our in culture of people. If we evaluate the amount of time which people spend on it. Another thing, people define success or aims of their life by it. Movies, television, sports has big impact here. People set role models, usually children. Children set role models according to those cultural phenomena. There were times where like famous musicians or artists were role models. Now internet influencers are actually important role models for children. So, and they define mentality of people. Many things which come to society and become norm in society, they originally were in movies, and they come to society through movies. So movies is an important instrument in promoting of new values. Another thing is a family system, which also in the world is very different. And recently I heard and I read, I didn't believe my eyes, that the word patriarchal became in this world, at least here in America, it became something bad. And people like, at least secular people already are using the word patriarchal as some bad model of society. Well, according to Bible, it is complete norm. All this and many other points in the culture should help for God's nation to hold really as a very separate and very different from these worldly nations. And that's exactly how it is seen in Bible, where Balaam, being prophet of God, though kind of bad prophet, but still, he says what God tells to prophesy. In Numbers 23:9, we already read that text previously, studying this topic. It's very important. From the top of the rocks I see him, and from the hills I behold him. Lo, the people shall dwell alone and shall not be reckoned among the nations. So it is important that God's people are not reckoned among nations of this world, not in their culture, not in anything. Apostle Paul in Romans 12:2 writes very similar thing about people's conforming to the culture and mentality of nations of this world. Romans 12:2. And be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. So he urges us to get rid of any traditions which we might have inherited from nations from we came from, and take new culture, new mentality, new way of thinking of God's culture, of God's nation. The church must diverge further and further from the world if the world changes to the worse. And we know that the world does change to the worse. So the distinction between church and the world should be much bigger now than it was previously. And in the future, it must be even bigger. Unfortunately, many churches take a different stand, and the position is kind of to attract people from the world. The message is that, see, we are just like you are. In that case, church, of course, diminishes its position and diminishes its influence. And also, it is important that the more church is different from the world, the more attractive it is for those who want to escape the world. And people in search for God often want to be, they may understand that the world is not godly. They want to escape from God, from the world, searching for God. That's why church must be attractive for those people more than for those who just want one more experience of worldly life. On another side, if the church takes a very strong stand on all those positions, from cultural to even political and judicial, as we mentioned, it will be really not taken peacefully by the society. Yeah, God's people will be under suspect, and they will be even hated. And that actually can be a very good indicator of how well we are doing. Look, what does Jesus tell? In Mark 13:13, Jesus tells, and ye shall be hated of all men for my name's sake, but he that shall endure unto the end, the same shall be saved. So Jesus tells that those who follow him, hold his name, hold his principles, they will be hated of all world. Are we hated from all world because of being Christian? If not, whose problem it is? In John 17:4, Jesus tells, I have given them thy word, and the world hath hated them, because they are not of the world, even as I am not of the world. The same, because you are different nation, antagonistic to all worldly nation. They will be hated. And look, it wasn't only about pagans. It was even about other Jews who also kind of believed in one God, who had similar culture. But Jesus tells that the more they will go following his footsteps, the more will be distinction, even with other religious people. Roman Empire had religious tolerance, and that's interesting. They were tolerating all different kinds of religions, from Berbers to Egyptians. Actually, Egyptians had a big influence on Rome in last times of Roman Empire, and cults which were coming from East and Far East, from Mithraism, which is coming from Persia, all different kinds of religious systems. They were tolerated, except for two religions. You know which? Judaism and Christianity. Why? Why tolerant Romans tolerate everything besides Judaism and Christianity? Because these were the only two religions which did not integrate well into society. These were the only two religions which were disrupting the way how the society was functioning. if church is not hated in this world, possibly because it doesn't disrupt well enough, because it's not opponent anymore, because it became integrated. Interestingly, in the Western world, mostly culture of Islam is hated. Uh, it, Many things are kind of demonized in Western media, but those things, if we study them, we can see that their roots, Middle Eastern roots, actually come from biblical influence of all times. And they're not taken by Western people. Why? Because the culture of West is very different from biblical culture. Now, if we talk about disruption, that's exactly what Bible tells the early church was doing. Look, in book of Acts 16:20, we read, apostles, missionaries come to the city, and what happens in the city? Acts 16:20, and brought them to the magistrates, saying, these men being Jews do exceedingly trouble our city. So the city was good, everything was calm, good Mediterranean climate, and good living of people. And then those missionaries come and they trouble the city. They disrupt the society. In another place, Acts 19:29, and another city, and the same thing happens. And the whole city was filled with confusion. And having caught Gaius and Aristarchus, men of Macedonia, Paul's companions in travel, they rushed with one accord into the theater. Well, the theater was a place where they were gathering as people of the city to judge, to make certain decisions, etc. So that's what is happening here also. Paul, with his companions, enters into the city, and the city fills with confusion. There is no confusion before they came. In Acts 17, 6 and 7, let me read, another place. And when they found them not, they drew Jason and certain brethren unto the rulers of the city, crying, these that have turned the world upside down are come hither also, whom Jason has received, and these all do contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, one Jesus. Oh, it's not just turning the world upside down, that is about disrupting the society. They do contrary to the decrees of Caesar, and they have another king. And listen, that's exactly what no government will tolerate. Government wants a monopoly of authority. There should be no other kings. And now these guys, they have different kings. We were just speaking about power branches, right? That the legislative, judicial, and executive. And over here, the conflict comes because of blaming of that they do not accept power of our government. Well, it wasn't just this disruption and troubling. It wasn't just in Book of Acts. We read about it even in Old Testament times when the kingdom of Israel was going away from God. God's prophet was the one who was a troublemaker. First King 18:17, I read. And it came to pass when Ahab saw Elijah that Ahab said unto him, art thou he that troubles Israel? God's prophet is troublemaker. So among worldly nations, God's people should be troublemakers. Otherwise, we're not making our functions. Another thing is how God may see his people. His people are here on earth, left in order to do certain job inside countries which are those countries are enemies of God. What does it mean politically? There is a special terminology. The terminology came in 1936, and it is did it here, fifth column. Well, what was happening actually that the two parties and a civil war in Spain in 1936, and when one of armies of parties of Franco was moving towards the city. The general told that he is moving 4 columns of army to the city, but inside the city there is a 5th column, which are not military people, they're just people who live in the city, but who are on his side. And he told that, well, as soon as I approach the city, those people inside the city, they will help me. So this was General Franco. In general, not good guy, but I just bring it to explain the terminologies. The 5th column is people inside that city who support the army which approaches. And Jesus, when he leaves his apostle on earth, he tells something seemingly similar. In John 17, 15 and 18, I read, I pray not that thou shouldest take them out of the world. He prays about apostles and his disciples in general. Not take them out of the world, but that thou shouldest keep them from the evil. They are not of the world, even as I am not of the world. Sanctify them through the truth, that word is truth. And thou hast sent me into the world, even so I also send them into the world. Well, missionary work, of course, but missionary work is also them being inside worldly nations, but not belonging to worldly nations. So being his agents, continuing being citizens of his kingdom, but being present in kingdoms of this world. Something similar, actually, Egyptians were suspecting Hebrews to be in book of Exodus. Look, in Exodus chapter 1, verses 9 and 10. And he said unto his people, it is Pharaoh speaking to his counselors, behold, the people of the children of Israel more and mightier than we. Come on, let us deal wisely with them. Let them multiply, and it come to pass that when there follows out any war, they join also unto our enemies and fight against us, and so get them up out of the land. So he sees Hebrews as a 5th column inside his country. Well, actually, God's people should be a 5th column inside these worldly nations, inside this world, because being here, we should continue in our hearts and in our minds to be citizens of his kingdom. And that implies like being of the same culture and having the same king, Christ. The world wants very different thing. The world wants the church to be, even though separated from government, but in submission to government. This church in submission to state. The culture of church watered down, diminished, the church belittled, just on the level of your golf club, just on the level of any NGO, which is like non-government organizations, like humanitarian organization, or some subculture, like those who ride motorcycles. They also have their subculture of motorcycle drivers, etc. So the world wants church to be something like that, a subculture, completely powerless, just people having fun in a certain way, but not troubling the society. Church must not be belittled this way, because it should oppose all worldly countries, and church should be even stronger than worldly countries, and church should be different in everything, not partially, because the future of the church is to destroy these countries. The church, in prophecy of Daniel, at which we started our study, we saw that the stone formation goes not by human hands, but by God's hand. So God prepares his church, his remnant people, And then that stone rolls and crushes the idol, which is world religious systems and world governments. So, and the stone should be outside. If it is integrated inside, it will not do its work. Again, we look at what we studied at the very beginning of our study, our first meeting. That is what is the mission which God waits from his nation to accomplish. Let us pray for that.